Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, Trump draws a line again. A new shortened deadline for Russia, a major trade breakthrough with Europe, and fresh action to protect religious rights at home. Mari Otsu has more on the president's high-stakes week. A massive cyber attack is halting air travel across Russia. Arian Pazdar has more on the impact and who's claiming responsibility. President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance voiced concerns over reports of starvation in Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel says that a child who appears to be starving in a viral photo actually suffers from a genetic disease. Jason Perry with the details. Thailand and Cambodia agreeing to a ceasefire after a short but deadly escalation. That's after President Trump suggested he would end trade talks with the two countries if they didn't reach a peace deal. Jack Bradley reports.
This is NTD Evening News, live from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. President Trump issuing a new deadline for Russia to end its war in Ukraine. The announcement comes during Trump's high-profile meeting with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and follows what may be Trump's biggest trade deal yet, slashing tariffs with the EU and securing hundreds of billions in energy and defense purchases. Meanwhile, here at home, the administration unveils sweeping new guidance protecting religious expression in the federal workplace. NTD's Mari Otsu has more from the White House.
There's no reason in waiting. We just don't see any progress being made.
President Trump setting a new deadline of 10 to 12 days for Russia to end the war with Ukraine or face sanctions and secondary tariffs. This comes just 2 weeks after the president imposed a 50-day deadline on Russia to make a peace deal, threatening to punish countries trading with Russia with a 100% tariff.
We thought we had that settled numerous times, and then President Putin goes out and starts launching rockets into some city like Kiev and kills a lot of people in a nursing home or whatever. Yep. I'm disappointed in President Putin.
Trump says he'll revise the deadline within the next day. Meanwhile, on trade.
And it's a big deal. It's a huge deal. So again, congratulations and many thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
President Trump striking his biggest deal yet with the EU on Sunday. The deal reduces the threatened 30% tariff on most European goods to 15% and includes a 0% tariff on American exports. The EU also agrees to buy $750 billion in U.S. energy, invest another $600 billion in the U.S., and buy more American military equipment. Across the Atlantic, President Trump's top trade officials met with their Chinese counterparts today in Stockholm. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says a goal includes extension of the 90-day trade truce agreed on in May. And here at home, the Trump administration on Monday issued new guidance requiring federal agencies to protect religious expression in the workplace. Specifically, it allows federal workers to pray in groups while off duty, invite coworkers to church, and display Bibles, crucifixes, or mezuzahs on their desks without fear of retaliation. The president talking about the administration's efforts in restoring traditional values and faith at a White House faith gathering in February.
So there could be nothing more beautiful than for us to gather in this majestic place. It is majestic, and reaffirm that America is and will always be one nation under God. At every stage of the American story, our country has drawn hope and courage and inspiration from our trust in the Almighty. Deep in the soul of every patriot is the knowledge that God has a special plan and a glorious mission for America.
The latest guidance comes after the president signed an executive order eradicating anti-Christian bias in February and an EO establishing the Religious Liberty Commission in May. Reporting from the White House, Mari Otsu, NTD News.
And in Russia, a massive cyber attack is impacting air travel across the country. National airline Aeroflot had to cancel over 100 flights, leaving thousands of travelers stranded. And the Kremlin further comments on a possible meeting between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pazdar has the story.
Thousands of passengers in Russia are left stranded on Monday after a cyber attack. Russian airline Aeroflot had to cancel more than 100 flights and delay others. Russian lawmaker Anton Gorelkin says Moscow is under digital attack. Quote, "We must not forget that the war against our country is being waged on all fronts, including the digital one." He added that he doesn't rule out that the attack was committed by a, quote, "unfriendly nation." Unconfirmed reports say a pro-Ukrainian group called Silent Crow is behind the cyber attack. The Kremlin commented on those reports on Monday.
The information that we read in the public domain is quite alarming. We will, of course, clarify the information and wait for appropriate answers.
Silent Crow has previously claimed responsibility for other attacks on Russia this year, including the IT department of Moscow's government, a state telecommunications company, and a large insurance company. Some of those resulted in big data leaks. Also on Monday, the Kremlin further commented on a possible meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Trump. Last week, Trump said he might travel to China in September to attend a commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Putin is scheduled to be there as well.
If it turns out that the U.S. president also decides to visit China on the same dates, then of course such a meeting cannot be ruled out.
But the spokesman added that so far there's no confirmation that Trump will visit China. Meanwhile, in Ukraine on Monday, soldiers and civilians gathered in Kiev's Independence Square, commemorating the third anniversary of an explosion that killed 53 Ukrainian prisoners held by Russia in the occupied Donetsk region.
Today we bow our heads before those who were captured, who went through these inhumane tortures, and who unfortunately died there.
Last month, a report by the Center for Human Rights in Armed Conflict said Russia was responsible for the deaths of the Ukrainian POWs in 2022. Arian Pastar, NTD News.
Humanitarian aid entering the Gaza Strip appears to be increasing amid reports of starvation in the territory. Meanwhile, Israel says that a viral photo of a child who appears to be starving actually depicts a 5-year-old who has a genetic disease. NTD's Jason Perry has the story.
Over the weekend, a spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces gave this message on the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip.
I cannot emphasize enough. Israel is not blocking humanitarian aid. We are facilitating its entry every single day.
And he said that in the past week, international aid organizations collected over 600 truckloads of aid inside the Gaza Strip. This comes as Israeli forces have begun daily 10-hour pauses in fighting in certain parts of the Gaza Strip in support of humanitarian aid deliveries. At the same time, Israel, along with the United Arab Emirates and Jordan, have also been airdropping humanitarian aid throughout the territory. But many are saying it's still not enough, including Vice President J.D. Vance.
I don't know if you've all seen these images. You've got some really heartbreaking cases. You've got little kids who are clearly starving to death.
But are they really images of starving children? Some are questioning why the adults near the children look healthy while the children do not. On Monday, Israel said that a picture went viral of a child, 5-year-old Osama al-Rakab, purportedly as evidence that Israel is starving children, while in actuality, the child has a genetic disease. In a post on X, Israel said that they've coordinated Osama's exit from Gaza with his mother and brother, and that he is now receiving treatment in Italy. President Trump also commented on images coming from the Gaza Strip.
Some of those kids that's real starvation stuff. I see it. And you can't fake that. So we're going to be even more involved. We're going to set up food centers, and we're going to do it in conjunction with some very good people.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu shared his thoughts on the situation.
Israel is presented as though we are applying a campaign of starvation in Gaza. What a bold-faced lie. There is no policy of starvation in Gaza, and there is no starvation in Gaza. We enable humanitarian aid throughout the duration of the war to enter Gaza. Otherwise, there would be no Gazans.
Israel did previously block humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip from March until May for what they said was to pressure Hamas to release the hostages. Israel also accused Hamas of stealing aid to fund its operations. Jason Perry, NTD News.
A ceasefire deal has been reached between Thailand and Cambodia. It comes after President Trump suggested he would end trade negotiations with the two nations if they didn't stop fighting. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
An immediate and unconditional ceasefire.
The prime ministers of Thailand and Cambodia shaking hands and agreeing to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire on Monday. They started their talks in Malaysia over the weekend. They were joined by a team from the U.S. State Department and Chinese officials.
Today we have a very good meeting and very good results to return to normalcy of the relationship.
I would like to express my sincere appreciation to Prime Minister Anwar, the government of China, and President Trump for.
Tensions arose between the two countries at the end of May. That's when a Cambodian soldier was shot and killed during an exchange of gunfire with Thai soldiers at a disputed area along their 500-mile border. Then, last week, a Cambodian landmine exploded at the border, injuring several Thai soldiers. The next day, fighting broke out, killing nearly 40 people and many civilians, and displacing around 300,000 local residents from both countries. President Trump said he called the leaders of both countries on Saturday, saying he would stop trade talks with them unless they agreed to a ceasefire. The next day, both leaders agreed to attend what came to be the successful peace talks in Malaysia.
During the trade, I said, I'm not going to do any trade deal unless you guys settle your differences. And we got it settled in 24 hours. I mean, they just announced it was settled.
President Trump taking to social media after the ceasefire was announced, saying, "By ending this war, we've saved thousands of lives. I've instructed my trade team to restart negotiations on trade." The U.S. is set to impose a 36% tariff on both Thailand and Cambodia. That's if they don't strike a trade deal with the U.S. by August 1st. Now, Thailand is a major ally of the U.S., while Cambodia is one of Beijing's closest allies in the region. But Trump's promise of a trade deal with the two countries could pay off.
One of China's hopes had been that Trump's new aggressive tariffs would drive other Asian nations toward China. But you notice he announced simultaneously with the Japanese deal, a deal with Indonesia and a deal with Philippines. So it's clear that his policies have had the reverse effect of what China wanted. They're actually drawing those countries closer to us.
This comes after Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with several foreign ministers, including from Cambodia and Thailand, at the ASEAN summit in Malaysia earlier this month. That's where Rubio said that the Indo-Pacific region is a focal point of the administration, saying that it'll determine the course of history in the near future.
The story of the next 50 years will largely be written here, in this region, in this part of the world.
Reporting by Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Ghislaine Maxwell, former associate of Jeffrey Epstein, is urging the Supreme Court to overturn her sex trafficking conviction. Maxwell is currently serving a 20-year sentence for sex trafficking. She was convicted for carrying out a years-long scheme with Epstein to groom and sexually abuse underage girls. In a brief file today, her attorneys are urging the Supreme Court to take up an appeal they submitted in April. They claim Maxwell was covered by a non-prosecution agreement Epstein made with federal authorities, which they say extends to others such as family members and friends. Federal prosecutors have argued that the agreement applied only in Florida and did not bind New York, where the charges against Maxwell were brought. Democrats are blocking the government funding process and the president's nominations in the Senate with no clear demands. Our Washington correspondent Luis Eduardo Martinez has more on the story.
The Senate has over 130 executive branch nominations pending confirmation. Republicans are blaming Democrats for blocking their advancement at every step of the way.
You look at the nominees, and we're about twice where the president was in 2017 in terms of noms across the finish line, but with zero Democrat cooperation. I mean, they're doing it on everything. And I remind people that Trump is the first president in history that hasn't had one of his noms by this point of his presidency confirmed either by unanimous consent or voice.
Senate Democrats have also threatened to block the appropriations process for fiscal year 2026, demanding that no other rescissions package be considered.
Rescissions is just a Washington name for double cross. They support one thing one day, the president even signs off, and then they come back and say they changed their mind.
There's a debate right now on Congress as to the extent to which these things upset the appropriations process. We do not believe they do. We think that the rescissions bills, in fact, make the appropriations process work and allow taxpayers to receive some dividend for the fact that we're $37 trillion in debt.
The latest Wall Street Journal poll showed that 63% of voters have an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party, the lowest that it has been in 35 years.
What do I make of that Democratic, the poll? Yes, we're in the doghouse yet again. What I see and what I hear from my constituents, everybody is anxious, upset, worried. They're worried about Gaza. They're worried about war crimes in Ukraine.
I don't put a ton of stock into, polls, especially this far away from an election, but we certainly do have a problem, and it's a messaging problem.
Despite Democratic lawmakers acknowledging that their party has a messaging problem, former North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper announced his bid for a Senate seat under an unchanged Democratic messaging platform.
Biggest corporations and the richest Americans have grabbed unimaginable wealth at your expense. And the decisions we make in the next election will determine if we even have a middle class in America anymore. Cutting health for the poor and even putting Medicare and Social Security at risk just to give tax breaks to billionaires.
It is expected that the Republican National Committee Chair Mike Whatley will run against Roy Cooper in the North Carolina Senate race. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
Coming up, a dangerous heat wave is sweeping across the country, triggering widespread warnings as temperatures climb to record-breaking levels. Experts share who's most vulnerable to the extreme heat. Idaho cut out sugary drinks and candy from its SNAP program, and a promise from Health Secretary RFK Jr. to fix the vaccine injury compensation program. Jason Blair has the latest on Kennedy's Maha initiatives after the break. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. More than 200 million Americans, that's nearly 2/3 of the population, are under heat alerts from the Midwest to the East Coast, with the Southeast expected to face the worst of the heat. NTD's Christina Corona tells us more.
Cities across the U.S. from South Dakota to Florida are baking under dangerous heat and extreme humidity this week. Heat index values are soaring between 105 and 115 degrees, with some areas in Mississippi and Louisiana nearing 120 degrees. Most record highs Monday are expected in Florida and Georgia, with heat index values also reaching up to 115 degrees. Several major cities are under extreme heat warnings, including New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, Omaha, and Charleston. The Northeast, from Philadelphia to Boston, including New York City, is also facing several days of dangerous heat, with heat index values expected to range from mid-90s up to 104 degrees on Monday. Tampa, Florida hit a record of 100 degrees on Sunday, marking the hottest temperature ever recorded there in 130 years. Dr. Larry Kenney, a physiology professor at Penn State, explains who is most at risk during this heat wave.
One of the reasons that older individuals are most at risk is because they sweat less on an average basis. Their hearts are more vulnerable in terms of the aging left ventricle. And so, again, it's mostly people over the age of 65.
He says extreme heat and humidity become dangerous when the body can no longer sweat effectively. The heart works harder to cool the body, putting serious strain on it. According to CDC data dating back to 2020, extreme heat kills nearly 2,000 Americans each year on average. Cooling centers offer relief for those without AC or shelter during extreme heat. To find one in your area, individuals can call 211 for locations and resources. Christina Corona, NTD News.
A busy week for Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. After spending the week touring Colorado and Idaho, he participated in the 2025 National Governors Association meeting over the weekend. NTD correspondent Jason Blair joins us now for some takeaways.
Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. just finished up a tour going to Colorado and Idaho. In Idaho, he met with Governor Brad Little to discuss some of the changes the state is making. The governor signed a proclamation making some changes by restricting cell phone use among students in public schools, as well as eliminating the SNAP benefits, allowing sugary drinks as well as candy to be purchased on the SNAP program for the state.
For freedom, if you want to drink a Coke, you ought to be able to do it. But the American taxpayer should not be paying for it. Today, 38% of teens are pre-diabetic or diabetic. I think it's 18% of the food stamp program when it goes to candies or sodas. 10% go to sugar sodas. And so we're poisoning the poorest Americans, giving them diabetes, and then we're paying for it with Medicaid in the long run.
We recognize the crisis that exists at the national level and at the state level. So it's incumbent that we partner with the federal government to make sure that all the programs that are there increase the health of the entire population.
And Secretary Kennedy also attended the National Governors Association's 2025 meeting in Colorado. He spoke with governors there, a bipartisan group of U.S. governors, really pushing and trying to talk them into making changes in their state revolving around his Maha agenda. Here are a couple of clips from that meeting. In this first one, Secretary Kennedy had just given stats about how in California, according to studies, 1 in 12 boys are diagnosed with autism now.
This is an apocalypse. And the same is true, that's just two diseases, diabetes and autism. And then you look at there's hundreds and hundreds of autoimmune diseases that started around 1989. I went on a long hike with Dr. Oz this morning. He showed me a data point of a study that they just finished that showed that if you could get every American to do a 15-minute walk a day, it would save the country $150 billion.
Secretary Kennedy also announced that he's working with Attorney General Pam Bondi to make changes to a vaccine injury compensation program that he says no longer achieves its, quote, congressional intent. Kennedy says the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, or VICP, has developed into a morass of inefficiency, favoritism, and outright corruption as government lawyers and the special masters who serve as vaccine court judges prioritize the solvency of the HHS trust fund over their duty to compensate victims. The VICP is a government program that has been in operation since 1988. People who believe they have been injured by a vaccine can file a petition for possible compensation. The program says it was created, quote, after lawsuits against vaccine companies and healthcare providers threatened to cause vaccine shortages and reduce U.S. vaccination rates, which could have caused a resurgence of vaccine-preventable diseases. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
Coming up in trade, President Trump is making deals and making money. How many countries have made deals so far, and how much has the U.S. Treasury made from tariffs? Kevin Hogan brings us the data. And what are the key takeaways from the trade deal between the U.S. and the EU? And could President Trump's trade moves impact how he addresses ongoing conflicts around the world? Ambassador Jim Gilmore joins us to discuss when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer, meeting with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer today. President Trump addressed the war in Ukraine, saying he's disappointed in Russian President Vladimir Putin. His comments come as the U.S. reached a trade agreement with the European Union over the weekend. Joining us now to discuss the key takeaways from that deal and its potential impact is Jim Gilmore, former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as the former governor of Virginia. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. Always great to have you. First,
thank you,
lots of developments to unpack here. Starting with the Trump-Starmer meeting, though, Trump said he'll impose secondary sanctions on Russia in less than 2 weeks if no ceasefire is reached, that is shortening his previous 50-day deadline. Now, these comments, of course, follow that trade deal between the U.S. and EU. Could Trump's leverage in trade be playing a role in how he addresses ongoing wars?
Well, I think what he's doing really is trying to treat the United States fairly. I think he believes that the trade imbalance is not working well for the United States, and he's pretty determined to continue to proceed with this. I think that trade policy is debatable. It's going to maybe end up meaning things cost a little more in the United States, but he believes that that is policy that is going to help create a more American strength, and it's going to mean long-term advantages for the American economy. The European Union is our primary trading partner. But I think that working at a 15% in this way is something that he believes is going to work well for the United States.
I want to dig into that deal because the U.S.-EU deals framework includes that 15% tariffs across the board, including on EU automakers. The 50% on steel remains in place, though, as well as, say, $750 billion worth of U.S. energy and $600 billion worth of additional investments in the U.S. What does this deal mean for the EU bloc, but also the U.S.?
Look, I think the deal means that the United States is going to be able to sell better into the European Union. And it's going to be more protective of American industries and people who are selling here. You would have to really study very closely what is the thinking of the European Union on this. Most of the headlines say they just got the best deal they thought they could get. But at the end of the day, this means that American products will go into the European Union at no tariff, which means they're going to be cheaper goods, which means that the European citizens are going to be able to buy things less expensively. But over here, what we're doing is we're trying to protect United States manufacturers and try to bring back more of the industrial base to the United States. So that's what he's working to do with this tariff policy. I mean, I think it's controversial, frankly.
And Ambassador, zooming out a bit here, though, how could this EU trade deal impact China, especially given the EU's criticisms of China dumping cheap products in their markets and the 10th summit last Thursday in China, where EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said EU-China trade ties were at a, quote, clear inflection point. How will this EU deal likely change the dynamic between the EU and China?
Well, I think that the reports are that the Americans and the Chinese are beginning their negotiations right now. And there was a deadline, but it's likely to be extended so that the negotiations can go on. I think what the Chinese are seeing is the United States is serious about a trade tariff policy and that it will most likely apply to China. What China is doing with its economic policy over the last number of years is that they're basically dumping things and using an industrial policy to make themselves the workshop and to make the other countries around them weaker. I think that this means that Trump's policy is going to be to try to bring more balance back into that and try to restore America's manufacturing capacity. And it means we will probably have less dependence on China going forward, particularly with respect to some of the strategic materials that I think are under discussion. To be direct with your answer, the United States is really focused, I think, on China trade because that is a place that we've been in an imbalance. It probably wouldn't matter if China was a friendly nation, but for some reason, I think they have made a nationalistic decision that they want to be dominant, at least in the Pacific, if not beyond. They have become an enemy and an adversary of the United States in an unnecessary way. So I think that they're going to see a trade policy that now is not going to be as friendly towards China as it's been in the past.
And expanding on that, Ambassador, as you mentioned, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent kicked off day one of closed-door meetings with his Chinese counterpart in Sweden today. They are discussing how long the current tariff truce can hold and key issues like U.S. sanctions related to fentanyl trafficking and China's purchases of sanctioned Russian and Iranian oil. What are you watching to come out of these talks?
Well, one thing that I'm watching is the fact that the president has shortened the time frame for Putin to try to make peace in Ukraine to 12 days. And what that means is I think it's inevitable, certain, that there will be secondary sanctions placed upon the sale of Russian energy. Well, that matters directly to China, as a matter of fact. China's been buying their energy at a cheap rate. But this may very well apply some secondary sanctions to China. But I think that we all understand in the United States at this point that we're in a global conflict and that we have countries that for some reason have decided that their national interest means they need to be adversarial to the American national interest. I remind your viewers that the U.S. has been warm and friendly towards China ever since Nixon and Kissinger. The United States actually was the driving force to put China into the World Trade Organization in order to help China. The goal here was to build a friendly relationship with China. It is the Chinese who have decided to do a 180 flat backflip and become adversarial to the United States. At that point, the U.S. has to take all actions necessary to protect itself, both military and also in trade relations. And I think that's the topic that you're talking about now.
Ambassador Jim Gilmore, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And on to the economy. We're approaching that August 1st trade deal deadline. President Trump has already secured trade deals with a few countries, which he's calling big. But how could countries that miss the deadline be affected? And what will that mean for the U.S.? NTD's data reporter Kevin Hogan has the numbers for us.
President Trump's August 1st tariff deadline is approaching, and it's almost here. So what will happen at that time? Well, some countries with blocks that, or blocks that haven't reached deals could see tariffs on their U.S.-bound exports rise to 25 to 50%. So that's very big. Again, going back to the Liberation Day tariffs. Now, that's because this administration sent them a letter. Countries that haven't been sent a letter will likely boomerang back to Liberation Day tariffs. That could be 10 to 50%, so very close. Just depends on which block you're talking about. Now, will that cause prices to rise? Well, that's unclear, but it is possible that you could see goods from shoes, coffee, microwaves, all those could go up. Now, inflation hasn't gone up as expected from tariffs, but these analysts tell ABC that those particular products, you could see some prices rise in that particular area. Now, as I was saying, you have prices that could rise, but what about the countries? And what do all these high-level officials say? Well, Howard Lutnick says that August 1st tariff deadline, that is a hard deadline, right? Now, the Treasury Secretary tells CNBC that he would think that a higher tariff level would put, quote, more pressure on these other countries in order to reach better deals, right? So they just want better agreements. They're putting the pressure on to see what's going to happen at that point. So that's how this administration is viewing all this. Now, they say they're not going to rush for the sake of making deals. And when asked if that deadline could be extended, they say, well, if they're working on one, he says, we'll see what the president wants to do. Now, deal or no deal, let's look at a map. This information comes from the White House, Axios, Associated Press, Newsweek, Courts, compiling a lot here. Countries in green have trade deals with the United States. Countries are blocked. Red, no deal, right? You see Canada, Mexico, and orange, it's a preliminary deal. Some very notable partners in the U.S. that do not have deals, North America, Canada, and Mexico. But again, deals have been reached with the United Kingdom, and that has also brought auto tariffs way down. Because remember, the United Kingdom would have had to pay 25% tariffs on their products if they hadn't. But that is no longer the case. Now it is 10%. That's for autos, right? So Americans can sell more beef and they can sell more ethanol. It's made from corn to the British, while the UK, they get a break somewhat from those tariffs for their auto exports. President Trump calls the agreement with Vietnam a great deal of cooperation between the two countries. It's pretty lopsided, though, in favor of the United States. Remember, America first is what President Trump campaigned on. So now why do I say that? Well, goods, U.S. goods going to Vietnam enter duty-free. That's right, 0% tariffs, whereas Vietnamese goods, they're going to see a 20% tariff on their goods. So, like I said, very lopsided. And then there's Indonesia. This allowed Indonesia to bypass the 32% reciprocal tariffs that they would have had to pay, right? So that's no longer the case. And now it's going to see 19% tariffs slapped on their goods. The country has already agreed to buy 50 jets from Boeing. So definitely benefiting the United States in that respect. And now the deal with the Philippines. This is, again, another deal that is lopsided in America's favor. That's because the United States, they're not going to pay any tariffs whatsoever, 0, on their goods, whereas those Japanese goods are going to see 19% levies all across the board. Now, one of the big ones, this is Japan, another deal that Trump calls the largest deal in history. Now, through this deal, Japanese goods are no longer going to be hit with that 24% reciprocal tariff. Instead, they're going to face a lesser 15%. So they dodged that bullet. Now, Japan has agreed to open its doors to American products, and it will invest $550 billion in the United States. So what does that mean? More Toyota plants? No, not necessarily. It means that Japan will provide that money, and then Trump or his officials will decide what investment it goes toward. It could be pharmaceuticals, for example. It's similar to a sovereign wealth fund, like the ones that Norway and Saudi Arabia has, and the United States will keep 90% of the profits that come from that fund, right? So now next is China. This is a preliminary agreement right now, so those steep tariffs, remember, that was Liberation Day, and then that escalation that happened, that would have been 145% tariffs that China would have had to pay. That's been cut way down to 30%. So this means that even though they're still finalizing the nuts and bolts, the deal will make it easier for the U.S. to obtain Chinese magnets and rare earth minerals, which are essential for making microchips. Very, very important. So now, as for the deal with the EU that just came in, President Trump says this is the biggest deal ever made. It's still just a framework at this point, but it could knock down the tariffs from the European Union from that 30% all the way down, cut it in half to 15%. So that's what they're looking at, right? Now, the EU will purchase $750 billion of American energy. Now, this is all according to CNN. This one is also lopsided, with U.S. goods going to the EU having no tariffs on them. Now, what about tariff revenue? What does this actually look like? Is the U.S. becoming richer because of the tariffs? Let's take a look. So we'll start off with where it was. Here, you're looking at tariff revenue combined with excise tax revenue. And this is basically for the first half of the year. That is through early July for each year going back to 2017. Now, this is according to data from the Treasury statements that were reviewed by the Bipartisan Policy Center. So historically, what has that total been? It was hovering right at about $43 billion. So that's that average that you see. Now, but the Trump 2.0 effect has that shooting up to north of $100 billion. That's $104 billion. Now, that is way up from that average. Specifically, that's about $60 billion up from that average. That's the big story right here. You see, this year, the Treasury reported a lot of deficits, basically one every month. But the surge in revenue from Trump's tariffs actually contributed to a surplus of just over $27 billion in the month of June, right? So that's having a big effect on the budget. Remember here, you're looking at tariff and excise tax revenue, okay? But Customs and Border Patrol data seen by Axios shows that over $80 billion of that revenue is from tariffs. So that's having much more of an effect. The excise tax is not the reason why this is going up. So there you have it. Deals in the works, and no deals. And how much bank the U.S. is making on the tariffs. Back to you.
As nations around the world are seeking trade deals with the U.S., do everyday Americans approve of President Trump's tariff strategy? NTD's Sam Wong was out on the National Mall in D.C. to hear from the people.
How do you think President Trump's tariffs have been working?
Pretty good so far. The United States is making money off of it where they weren't before, and so far I think it's doing good in the country.
I think he's trying to get the trade imbalance back in balance. I think there will be good and bad in all of it. Now, what's going to come out on top, I don't know.
I was a little surprised that countries were bowing down to the United States already. That surprised me. So if that's a good thing that comes out of it, that they're willing to work and compromise a little bit, I think that's something good. But I think we're going to feel a little bit of hurt before anything gets much, much better.
I understand tariffs have a mixed effect on the country in terms of possibly raising prices, but also creating American jobs and protecting American businesses. So you can go on either side of the aisle, but I think he's very effectively using it as a negotiating tool, which is ultimately going to benefit the United States in terms of trade and economic opportunity.
A lot of people are concerned about prices going up, so I guess the question here would be, have you noticed any price increase in your grocery shopping or anything else?
Not really.
Prices have gone down for groceries.
I have not. I know inflation continues to slightly grow, but it's nothing compared to what happened in 2021.
I don't necessarily think it's the new administration, but something happened to make grocery prices go up, obviously.
He's been in office for, this is July, so 7 months already, and we haven't seen anything. I work at a dealership in the town that I live in, and as far as automotive, I hadn't really noticed anything a great deal. Some of the things have put a stranglehold on our parts being able to get in, some of the shipping and different things like that. We've definitely seen that.
How do you think this is impacting the U.S.-China rivalry?
Yeah, I think it's just trying to level the playing field, just so that we don't have such a a negative trade deficit with them.
I think China probably is ultimately the big issue that Trump's trying to work on, and I do think he's trying to use tariffs and the trade deals he's already making with other countries in the European Union to put pressure on China to get into a better situation for the United States in terms of our trade with China.
That's one thing that bothers me is the fact of a lot of this stuff, that our phones, for example, I mean, it's essentially slave labor that builds a lot of these things, and it shouldn't be that way. So yeah, that's one of the things that we need to stress and push, is for them to stop.
Maybe the tariffs will come into play where we'll disperse some of that, and that China will see that we don't support that.
Could Fed Chair Jerome Powell be replaced? Who would the new chair be? Hear from economist Art Laffer, one of the minds behind President Reagan's economic policy. He says Trump's new policy avoids a massive tax hike and lays the groundwork for economic growth and deregulation. Tonight on Capitol Report at 7 p.m. Eastern. Coming up, one official in Southern California tells our David Lamb that he's hopeful about cleaner water and air as the U.S. and Mexico are tackling a decades-long sewage problem. It's not an overnight fix, he says, but a step in the right direction. And Canada's biggest waterfront fireworks show was back for its 33rd year, featuring a snowbirds flyover, a performance featuring 400 drones and pyrotechnics. We'll take you to English Bay for the highlights when we come back here on NTD News. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A decades-long sewage crisis may finally be coming to an end. The U.S. and Mexico have agreed on a project to tackle the pollution that affects San Diego. NTD's David Lamb reports.
The crisis over pollution from raw sewage near San Diego may be getting an accelerated cleanup. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin and his Mexican counterpart Alicia Barcena Ibarra recently signed a memorandum of understanding. Zeldin said the Trump administration is proud to deliver this massive environmental and national security win for Americans in the San Diego area who have been living with this disgusting raw sewage flowing into their communities for far too long. Supervisor Jim Desmond, people near the San Diego border have been dealing with stench and pollution for decades. How do you feel about the U.S.-Mexico deal finally in agreement?
Very happy and ecstatic that this treaty has been reached, and we just got to make sure both sides keep their promises and to its fulfillment.
Desmond has been pushing for a solution and says the problem was so severe that U.S. Navy SEALs had to relocate as the water they trained in was polluted. Under the new deal, Mexico will pledge $93 million in funding, and Mexico will build its own infrastructure and facilities to treat its sewage. Untreated raw sewage has flowed into Southern California from Mexico, polluting the Tijuana River Valley, harming the region's economy and sickening people on both sides of the border. Beaches such as Imperial Beach have closed down.
They have restaurants. They've got, entertainment facilities. They've got, people that count on visitors coming to the beach. There hasn't been any for 3 years. So we have to make sure, that gets cleaned up and they're no longer dumping sewage into the Tijuana River, which flows downhill and unfortunately ends up in the U.S.
The construction project timeline is set to be completed by 2027, 4 years ahead of schedule. Desmond says it takes years to build the types of facilities to treat the sewage, where millions of gallons have been seeping through daily.
We've got to put a stop to that. Like I said, it's not going to be an overnight fix. It's going to take time, but we got to make sure that both sides are keeping up to the agreement.
EPA Administrator Zeldin said the project accounts for future variables, including population growth and operations and maintenance costs. David Lamb, NTD News, California.
Just north of the border, one of the world's longest-running offshore fireworks festivals lit up the skies of Vancouver last Friday. The Honda Celebration of Light, now in its 33rd year, is a beloved Canadian summer tradition. A dazzling display of lights, music, and national pride brought hundreds of thousands together by the bay. Here's a look at how Canadians celebrate summer in spectacular fashion.
A roaring sound broke the calm skies as the Royal Canadian Air Force Snowbirds soared over Vancouver's English Bay. The renowned aerobatics team opened the show with tight formations and dazzling stunts, carving silver arcs across the sky with their CT-114 jets, wowing hundreds of thousands of spectators.
Very incredible. The aerobatics, that was beautiful. That was gorgeous. I think that was wonderful. The choreography was pretty nice.
It was really cool. All synchronized. They were great. They were really good.
As night fell, 400 drones lit up the sky, forming images like the Canadian flag and maple leaves under the theme, Proud to be Canadian. The show also paid tribute to national heroes like Terry Fox, whose Marathon of Hope continues to inspire people across Canada and beyond. Set to stirring classic music, waves of colorful fireworks lit up the night sky, igniting a sense of wonder, joy, and shared celebration.
Irish, we came all the way just for this. Way better than anything I've ever seen.
Coming from a small village in Ireland, it's seeing this amount of people in one place, it's unseen. It really lifts your spirits.
And I always find it so interesting how they time it with the music. There was some really, really cool stuff going on here, and it was timed so perfectly.
Once again, united locals and tourists alike in a dazzling display of light, making Vancouver a top summer destination for visitors from around the world. NTD News, Canada.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com/live or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.